Look, I'd like to start by thanking you for coming and also acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians of this land, of all the wrongs that we need to right in this world, and sadly there's too many of them. Getting justice for our First Nations people is one of our key priorities, especially getting treaty. I'd like to also acknowledge any members of Parliament and councillors here tonight. Helen Burnett, I can see Gideon Cordova, I can see Andrew Wilkie, who will be one of our fantastic guest speakers shortly. Is there anyone else I have missed who's a councillor or a member of Parliament? Thank you. Look, we had an incredible demand for tonight. We felt like we could have easily filled the hall, but we had to restrict the numbers. This is an issue that's resonated with a lot of people. And I think tonight's film by Juan Passarelli, which is an awesome film, by the way. It's only 40 minutes, it's not long, and it gets straight to the point. Tonight's screening and discussion is very timely for us as a country. Unfortunately, it's been a long road for Julian Assange. But tomorrow, we're going to get the Brereton report. Now, some of you may have heard a bit about this. This report will detail a number of very serious alleged war crimes conducted by Australian Special Forces in Afghanistan. Breaches of human rights, criminality. It's been 15 years, it's been covered up, and we probably wouldn't have even got it had one of the troopers involved not taken a defamation action, and the courts demanded the release of these documents. So it's going to be a confronting a couple of days or weeks or months for our country, and I hope, as I'm sure a lot of you do, and I certainly know Andrew does, it stimulates some big discussions about why we go to and join the US in these pointless foreign wars, whether our special forces can conduct themselves in a way that is representative of our values as a democracy, and whether we're happy with what we're going to see. But to me also, I hope the conversation really happens in this country around our right to know what goes on within our defence forces and intelligence agencies. And while Australia will be having these discussions and these debates, meanwhile Julian Assange sits without charge in a prison rotting away in the UK, waiting to extradition to the country whose war crimes and gross human rights violations he exposed. And I might just kind of finish saying, I know everybody's been appalled at the behaviour of the Trump regime in recent weeks. You know, the belligerence, the arrogance, the brazen lies, attempts to undermine democracy, to poison the political waters for their own political interests. And for those who have been following the trial of Julian Assange, you probably won't be surprised by that kind of behaviour. But it almost seems like they don't fear anything. They have been so untouchable for so many years. What you'll see tonight is what they do fear. What they do fear is exposure by WikiLeaks and Julian Assange. And this film is going to lead to an excellent panel discussion following that. And I'll introduce the speakers when we get to around 7:15, 7:20 when the film finishes, and then we'll be having a panel discussion going into a Q&A. So we might get underway, and I'll look forward to introducing the panel when the film wraps up very shortly. Clap. We've got four fantastic speakers tonight. I might just go through them, just a little bit of background for each one of them very, very briefly, and then we'll go to, I'll ask them some questions and we'll get a discussion going. I might start by introducing Greg, who probably doesn't need a lot of introduction in the town of Hobart. Greg's an author, a political commentator, well-known human rights advocate, long-time Assange campaigner, including the WikiLeaks party campaign advisor and, of course, legal counsel. We have Mary. G'day, Mary. You hearing me okay? I'm actually supposed to look at you, not at the screen. So obviously Mary's very well known in Australia. She helped set up and develop the SBS TV in 1980. She was 20 years at the flagship news presenter for SBS, a former chair of the Sydney Peace Foundation, also a very well-known human rights advocate, and sits on a number of foundations and committees, and we're really rapt to have Mary here tonight. Mary has literally set up and live blogged every part of the court hearing to the closure of the court hearing recently. So, we'll get her to talk to some issues tonight. Of course, Andrew Wilkie, and I probably haven't said it publicly, but I've certainly said it to him privately, but Andrew was a hero of mine when he blew the whistle on weapons of mass destruction many moons ago now. And Andrew and myself, and I think Senator McKim and a few others were the founding members of the parliamentary Friends of Bringing Julian Assange Home to Australia. And of course that group has now incorporated members from the crossbench, Independents and Labor. And of course Andrew, which I'm going to be asking him a question about this shortly, has been over to the UK to do some fantastic advocacy. And I thank you very much, Chamira, at short notice for coming on tonight. Our other Amnesty guest wasn't well tonight. Chamira is a philanthropy manager at Amnesty, and if you're not aware, Amnesty's got a fantastic petition which has collected over 100,000 signatures already, which we'll be able to give you the details of, or I can actually provide that to you before you go. So I'd like to get as many people to sign that as possible. So it's interesting, the closing comment there by Kristen, who came to Canberra only recently and spoke at the press gallery. I better sit down. Not seem to be talking down to you guys. Definitely not two gentlemen that I would do that to. Tristan said this is not a left or right issue. This is an issue that's brought people from, or should be bringing people from right across the political divide. Now, I've got a number of questions I had sent to the guests tonight, but this one wasn't one of them. But I do want to say, Andrew, so I think that was really powerful there. Have you been able to successfully bring together politicians in Australia from across the political divide?
Have I been able to?
Have you been able to successfully bring together politicians in Australia to try and campaign within Parliament on bringing Assange home?
Just to explain how the Parliament works, there's obviously committees, formal committees, but then there's also informal groups called friendship groups or parliamentary groups. These groups are not part of the Parliament formally, but they are only established with the approval of the presiding officers, the President of the Senate and the Speaker of the House of Representatives. So much to our pleasure and somewhat surprise, the presiding officers did agree to a Bring Julian Assange Home parliamentary group to be established. We thought that might not have been the case. It's only got about less than 15 members currently, and that's out of 151 members of the House of Representatives and 76 senators. So it's not a big group. But interestingly, it does have members of the crossbench in both the Senate and the House. It has Labor Party members. It has a National Party member, Barnaby Joyce, and a Liberal National Party member, George Christensen. The only major party not represented is the Liberal Party. Now, make of that what you will. Of course, Barnaby and George they're mavericks at the best of times. Although I went to London, you'd be aware I went to London in February to visit Julian, and George also went along. And for a man who I would disagree with on almost everything, I found his take on Julian Assange and the principles at stake, he has a very clear understanding of that. He does see it as an attack on media freedom. He does see it as the Australian government abandoning an Australian overseas. He does see it as an outrageous attempt at extraterritoriality by the United States. So he's a good ally on this, and don't try and say extraterritoriality in front of a live TV camera.
Thanks, Andrew. And certainly, we've seen Pauline Hanson recently also call Julian Assange Australia's Ned Kelly overseas, and Barnaby Joyce played a very active role in getting David Hicks back to Australia. You may well remember that campaign. So there's a good basis there. But look, I might just go to you, Greg. We've seen a lot of the irregularities and the extraordinary nature of this trial in the film tonight. Could you update us, because it finished kind of at the September hearings? Could you update us on any developments in the trial, and more importantly, where do you think it will go from here? What's the process that we need to be aware of?
Sure. Thanks, Peter. Can I personally, just by starting by thanking Peter and Andrew and the number of MPs who have spoken out in support of Julian Assange. It's been gratifying, and particularly from Tasmania. It's been a very strong presence from this state, and in fact Tristan and the team that run the Assange campaign essentially in Tasmania have done a magnificent job. So let me just give you an update on where things are at. Firstly, I should say I just was talking to Julian's father tonight, and there's an outbreak of COVID in Belmarsh Prison and on Julian's wing, and I'm just been speaking to a couple of journalists about it, making the point that Maurice Payne, as Foreign Minister, ought to be very concerned about an Australian citizen whose health is not what it should be, particularly his physical health, and who's now exposed very directly to COVID in the context of the British prison system, which has not done a very good job on COVID. So, yet another reason to bring Julian Assange home. In relation to the hearing, a decision will be made on January 4. This is a matter that's currently in the Westminster Magistrates Court. If Assange wins, I've got no doubt there'll be an appeal. If Assange loses, there'll be an appeal. And that appeal will then go to the High Court, which is probably equivalent to our federal court, if we look at this in a federal system. In my view, this case will go all the way to the UK Supreme Court, which could take another 12 to 18 months. Extradition is an area of the law which is highly political and also has enormous amount of discretion built into it, both on the part of courts and ministers. And as you know, in essence, the defence here is that under the treaty between the United States and the UK, which was signed in 2003, there is a carve-out for political offences. So in other words, if a person is acting politically and motivated politically, then they can't be extradited. The second point, of course, is that the United Kingdom, theoretically at least, does not extradite people to countries where they face the death penalty, and there is a very strong argument made by most death penalty campaigners that 170 years is an effective death penalty. So there's that to be taken into account as well. I think, though, I have some optimism about the British courts. Some of my colleagues don't. The UK Supreme Court is a very liberal and progressive court. You've got to remember that was the court that brought Boris Johnson into line when he prorogued Parliament. It was the court that stood up to the government in the way in which it tried to steamroller Brexit. In my view, the UK Supreme Court would probably, if the case gets that far, be very sympathetic to Assange's cause. Now, having said that, of course, at the end of the day, there are a lot of political ramifications in this case, and of course it does rely on the Secretary of State having a say. The Secretary of State in the United Kingdom, Priti Patel, is a member of the hard right. She's one of Boris's hand-picked team of right-wingers who are there to essentially shore up the seats that the Conservative Party won in the north of England, and so therefore takes a very simplistic and hardline view of law and order issues. But that's where the matter is at the moment. So 4th of January key date, and then from there, no doubt, an appeal somewhere in the first quarter of next year.
So just a quick question for you on that, Greg. It seemed very obvious from the film tonight that WikiLeaks is political. They even used that word in the speech Julian gave to those university students. Their philosophy was to bring transparency to our political systems, to expose wrongdoings, corruption, war crimes, so on and so forth. How are the US arguing that this is not that they're not political and this is not a political witch hunt?
Yeah, so the United States argument is that he's a hacker, right, and that he stole. And that he also, their secondary argument is that he breached the espionage legislation. Now, one of the curious facts in this case, which is alarming, is that this is the first time the United States has sought to use its 1917 espionage legislation, which effectively says that if you reveal state secrets, you've committed an offence, or anything that's classified. They've used it in relation to a person who is not an American citizen, who did not set foot in the United States for the purposes of publication, who did not set foot in the United States for the purpose of obtaining material. If this prosecution succeeds, smart journalists in this country like Tony Walker, for example, senior, very eminent former foreign correspondent, Tony and others understand the ramifications of this case. It means that any journalist, for example, you have a look at those journalists at the moment, the ABC, who revealed alleged war crimes in Afghanistan. If they were talking about American soldiers, they could find themselves on the end of an extradition request. So that's why it's a very, very dangerous case.
Thanks, Greg. Look, I might go to you, Mary. I've got a couple of really interesting questions for you. Look, it highlighted in the film that, the Obama regime didn't extradite Assange on constitutional principles. There was no proper distinction between his conduct and that of other journalists, and I understand that's referred to as the New York Times problem. How have the US media reacted to his extradition trial?
How have the US media, did you say, Peter?
Yeah, the US media. Yeah, I'm just interested in this freedom of press, the First Amendment. That's so important to the US Constitution, and a number of the US media outlets published the WikiLeaks revelations. Yeah.
Yes. Well, the New York Times, of course, came out straight away and said that they, whilst they didn't agree with everything Assange had done, they were definitely opposed to his extradition because his activity was essentially journalistic activity, and by prosecuting Assange, it really opens the door for other journalists to be prosecuted and really makes a mockery of the First Amendment. It's interesting, Peter, and you'd be forgiven for not knowing this generally, because in February, on day one of the hearing, the prosecutor went to great lengths to convince all the journalists that were assembled that this was not about them, this was not about journalism. However, when the judge asked him, if we put the hacking charge aside, would receiving and obtaining information be a crime in itself? And he could not respond immediately because the answer was obvious. He obfuscated for quite some time, but in the end he had to say yes. Now, this should have rung alarm bells in the world of journalism everywhere. There should have been headlines: the United States criminalises journalism. In September, during the September hearings, the prosecutor said numerous times, the US government has never said that it won't prosecute journalists. So the February fig leaf was gone completely. Again, that should have made headlines, but it did not. I think that the New York Times and The Guardian are prepared to make certain, positive statements in support of or against extradition, but I don't think they and the mainstream press in general are coming out strongly enough. They didn't cover the September hearings adequately, the basis of the political prosecution, what he faces if he's extradited to the United States, conditions that will be cruel and inhumane, solitary confinement in a supermax prison, basically life in a steel shoebox 23 hours a day. And despite what US Attorney Gordon Kromberg alleged or testified that the conditions would be in the United States, he made out that ADX prison, he testified, really was some sort of holiday resort with all sorts of activities and social interactions. However, US attorneys that have had clients at ADX testified that that is not at all what happens. As a national security prisoner, he would be placed in solitary under SAM's conditions, special administrative measures, which are particularly harsh. And those cruel and inhumane conditions are a reason he should not be extradited. Furthermore, because he suffers from depression, and let's face it, who wouldn't? If you had felt persecuted for 10 years and you were being prosecuted and you were looking down the barrel of spending your life in a steel shoebox, that level of sustained anxiety leads to depression, and depression leads to a risk of suicide. And if you take away, and this is what part of the evidence we heard during the hearings, if you take away those things that give a person hope, contact with family, the calls Julian has been making to the Samaritans, that sort of thing, if that's taken away, then the risk of suicide increases.
Thank you, Mary. Look, I might on that point, I might go to Chamira. And Chamira, could you outline to us Amnesty International's position on both Assange's conditions at the moment and the prospects of him receiving a fair trial? And look, just to put it more broadly, does Amnesty accept that he's essentially a political prisoner?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Peter. And as well, I'd like to quickly acknowledge that my colleague Amy, who's based in Tasmania, has done a lot of great work with everyone there. And unfortunately, she couldn't make it. So happy to represent. And look, it's a really important question, and it's one I've been asked many times. And there's absolutely no doubt from Amnesty's perspective that Assange is considered a political prisoner, and that there's a political nature to this trial as well. And certainly there's been a number of indications of that. First and foremost, the fact that inherently this is a human rights issue. There's no doubt about that. Not only his treatment since being in Belmarsh, but also the pretty clear targeting and war, if you will, on journalism, which Assange seems to be the scapegoat for. And many of these words have clearly been said from Trump himself and a number of people in positions of power there in the US. So we've been very clear that this trickles onto a general sort of attack on the nature of journalism. We absolutely consider him a journalist. That's never been disputed either. And we wanted to make that extremely clear. So yeah, certainly see that there's a political nature to the trial. And obviously from understanding, there's a political clause in the extradition treaty from what we've been told. So by that right, that should disqualify him in many instances if that's proven to be the case. Thank
you, Chamira. Look, we've seen in the documentary tonight as well that this is kind of part of the let's call it the persecution of Julian Assange is part of a broader strategy directed at the media and it leaks. I've got some quotes here from the defence's closing submission, which you can read, by the way, folks. I can give you the link to it. It was released last Friday. It's long, but it's very easy to read, and it's got an incredible amount of detail in it. But I do warn you, it's very troubling. And to be honest, I haven't been watching the trial as closely as Greg and Mary have, for example. But it's yes, it's a lot worse than I expected it was. This whole thing after having read it. we all know Trump's, we know the kind of character he is, but he's consistently threatened the press. So this is a question for you, Mary. He's repeatedly referred to the press as the opposition party, the enemy of the people. He's denounced news media as sick, dishonest, crazed, unpatriotic, unhinged, totally corrupt, purveyors of fake news. It's logged in this defence submission. He's threatened the execution of journalists publicly, and it also quotes when President Trump met with FBI Director James Comey, and they agreed they would be putting a head on a pike as a message to journalists, and that was in 2017. How is this being accepted by the media community? Do you think the media community, both in Australia and overseas, is taking this broader attack on press freedom seriously, or as seriously as they should be?
Peter, it's preposterous, really, when you look at what the Prime Minister has said with respect to the allegations, or the Brereton report, the allegations of crimes committed by our SAS, the Prime Minister said that they need to be investigated and people should be prosecuted if they have committed war crimes. However, here we have a journalist who has revealed American war crimes, and the Prime Minister has said, well, he should go and face the music. And he has no prospect of a fair trial, not when public figures like Trump and other senior American figures really have called for his death. Now, we know President Donald Trump has been hostile generally to the media, but in terms of, in Julian's case, he's not covered. Trump is saying he's not covered by the First Amendment because he's a foreigner. And this, I believe, this is really driven by Pompeo, who's Trump's right hand. And it's really fueled, if you like, not just by Julian exposing war crimes, exposing the true intent behind US foreign policy, but also publishing Vault 7, and that was the CIA's secret toolbox, the tricks that they use to pretend that they are another country, the half a dozen different scripts they have access to. I think Pompeo and the intel agencies can't forgive Assange for that publication. But we should be very concerned when on the one hand we're saying here that Dan Oakes should not be prosecuted for those stories that the ABC ran. But on the other hand, we're happy for the prosecution of the whistleblower in that case, David McBride, to continue. And we're more than happy for the prosecution of an Australian citizen by the US who will, if he goes to the US, faces an unfair trial and faces life in prison.
Thanks, Mary. One thing that was very prominent in this defence's closing submission on behalf of Assange was a very deliberate attempt to subvert the International Criminal Court that Pompeo, Barr and Trump over many years have been undermining its legitimacy, and that part of this attack on Assange, whistleblowers, publishers and journalists, has been to avoid prosecutions of US personnel in the International Criminal Court. Greg, look, how important is this in the big scheme of things in terms of our right to know about what our special forces or government or intelligence agencies do on our behalf as citizens in a democracy? And do you agree? Do you think it's actually that sinister that this part of this attack on Assange and the freedom of the press is to avoid the potential for example, US personnel to be tried in an international criminal court?
Well, I think the US hostility to the ICC, of course, is well known. They didn't join They haven't joined under any administration, and I suspect that they won't join up under Biden because of their policy of exceptionalism. And also they think the ICC is going to be used to take potshots at their military personnel. But I do think more broadly that the Assange case represents for the United States the chilling reality that its military operations around the world can be exposed, should be exposed, and if you've of course seen the collateral murder video, you see cold-blooded killing on behalf of the United States. And Mary just talked a moment ago, and I think she's right, that for the United States security establishment and defence establishment, that publication in and of itself is deeply problematic, and if Assange is allowed to get away with it, it opens the doors and the floodgates to much further exposure of the United States and its nefarious activities across the globe. I'd say also, just very quickly, that to pick up again Mary's point, I am staggered by, and in fact I just did a tweet to Gavin Morris at the ABC, who was lauding Mark Willesee and everybody at the ABC for the great work they'd done on Afghanistan. If they don't link it to the Australian journalist, their colleague, who of course was ahead of them, and I don't mean that in a competitive sense, but was ahead of them by 10 years in the release of Collateral Murder, then you understand the absurd hostility or ignoring of Assange on the part of the Australian media. It needs to be remembered. We've been fighting with Peter Grester, for example, for some months now about his view and the view of a group that calls itself, I think, Australian Journalists for Freedom or Alliance or something, which is now essentially a News Limited Fairfax organisation, wants to define what a journalist is. And again, it's all about excluding Assange. Mark Willesee and Dan Oakes, they're journalists. Assange is not a journalist. They weren't reckless. Well, I'll tell you what, if you look at Collateral Murder and you look at that video of that bloke walking up to that Afghan and saying, "Did we take him out as well?" I don't know what the difference is if we talk about it being, I don't think it is reckless, I think it's truth, but if we're talking about recklessness. So, more broadly, I think you've got to be asking this question of journalists in this country and get on social media and make this point about the Afghan case. Why is it okay for Australian journalists to be lauded for their work, but another Australian journalist to be shunted into, as Bob Carr colourfully puts it, onto the baking plains of Oklahoma in a high security prison for the rest of his life?
Andrew, would you like to make a comment? Yeah.
If I could just add briefly, it's worth remembering that the US action against Assange is actually a very narrow, for a very narrow period of time. It's basically from late 2000, it's basically what WikiLeaks did and published from late 2009 to early 2011. So the American action isn't for everything WikiLeaks got up to, but for a very narrow period of time. And in essence, for WikiLeaks publishing all that information about military operations in Iraq and in Afghanistan, also publishing thousands of embassy cables, and also publishing information about the treatment of detainees at Guantanamo Bay. And I think that it is so narrow, it makes the point that this is all about getting even for the revelations such as Collateral Murder and that shocking footage from the attack helicopter.
Which, by the way, Andrew, was left out of the indictment deliberately. They didn't want that to be raised in court, did they?
Yes, but the US is very much, it's a very targeted attack on WikiLeaks to try and get even for those revelations, to deter other journalists, publishing houses, and importantly whistleblowers like Bradley, now Chelsea Manning. And it's to create an environment where they can do basically whatever they want anywhere in the world and it will remain secret. It's all about their concept of American exceptionalism, as Greg said, supremacy, and the right to do whatever they want, and it must not be reported. And heaven help any intelligence insider or military insider who breaks ranks, because we'll treat you just the way we've treated Chelsea Manning.
Thanks, Andrew. Look, my next question was for you, but before I go to you, I just wanted to check with Mary on something that Greg said then. Mary, do you think it's been part of the strategy of the US prosecution going back a number of years to make sure that Assange is not painted as a journalist, but something else?
Yes, they've tried to discredit him in numerous ways. First and foremost, I think his character, and I think this has been a concerted strategy. It's not unusual. This is how you isolate someone and make them an unsympathetic figure. So although, as Andrew says, these charges relate to a very specific set of publications, when people respond to Julian and what's happening to him, they say, oh, but he's responsible for Trump. So but he was, charged with rape in Sweden. Well, he was never charged with rape, and if they had enough evidence, they would have charged him. And in fact, we know from documents obtained by Stefania Marizzi, FOI documents, that the US government pressured the Swedish prosecutor not to close the case. They had a lot of trouble keeping that case open, and they kept it open under sustained pressure from the United States. We also know that in the case of Khalid Al-Masri, who benefited from WikiLeaks publications, that in his case, he was part of the illegal CIA rendition program, and when he was a German citizen, when the German prosecutor issued a warrant for the arrest of the CIA officers who kidnapped him, flew him to Afghanistan, tortured him for 6 months, and then dumped him in the mountains of Albania. It was in fact a case of mistaken identity. That this warrant was never issued because the US government put pressure on the German government to not do so.
Thanks, Mary. Well, let's go to those cables in that short period of time that Andrew's referred to. Andrew, obviously you're a whistleblower. That's how you came into politics, and what you did was very brave. And this is a question for Chamira as well. Perhaps I'll go to him after you. I mean, can you talk a little bit about the public good component of these disclosures, like why it's in the public interest to have these kind of documents disclosed? And this, I suppose, a philosophical question as well is, do you think citizens should know about the so-called dirty business of protecting democracies? Do you accept the argument that we don't need to know this, nor should we know that, and it's an essential part of operating in this kind of dark and shady world?
Look, a country obviously has a need to have some secrets. Some things need to be kept confidential, like the identity of a foreign person who's acting as a spy, who's giving us information. I mean, we don't want that person's name in the public domain. They'll be hauled in by their own government. The deception before the D-Day landings to deceive the Nazis, and the extraordinary deception operations that occurred then, and including keeping information from the British public in the UK so that the Nazis would not be aware of where the landing would be and when it would be and how it might be conducted. Obviously, there is a need for some secrets. But just as importantly, the public has a right to know what governments are doing in our name. We have a right to know why and where and what our military forces are getting up to. That is patently obvious, and all too often, including in Australia, including here in Tasmania, if you read the Mercury today, governments are prone to secrecy when it's unnecessary. And in fact, when there is secrecy, misconduct can occur unbeknown to us. Even when there's no misconduct, we start to suspect the worst. It was clearly in the public interest for WikiLeaks to act as journalists and as publishers and to reveal the information that they did about the war crimes being committed, in particular in Iraq and in Afghanistan. There is no doubt WikiLeaks acted in the public interest when it revealed the collateral murder video. We need to know that, and we need to hold people to account. And it's very upsetting that it's the publishers and the whistleblowers who are treated as the villains and criminals, and the pilots of that helicopter are treated as heroes. You know, it should be the other way around. Julian Assange, WikiLeaks, and Chelsea Manning, you know, they should be wearing medals and be feted as heroes. And the crew of that helicopter should be going to prison for war crimes. I'll wind this up really quickly because we don't have too much time. Can I just say, though, that not only do we need whistleblowers to reveal this stuff, we need journalists and publishers to report this stuff. And my own personal experience way back in 2013 was, I saw wrongdoing, but I couldn't do anything with that unless journalists were prepared to analyse it and to publish it and to get it out there. Otherwise, I was nothing, and the information I had was worthless. So we need to applaud our whistleblowers, and we need to give every protection to the media to act independently and bravely and to reveal the information that the whistleblowers have. Otherwise, the whole lot of them are useless.
Thanks, Andrew. And certainly, if we had time tonight, we could talk about Witness K, but we'll have to save that for another time. Chamira, I understand Amnesty made some strong comments around the disclosure of the Yemen files because it was revealed that the US forces had handed over prisoners to the Yemenis who had a significant track record of human rights abuses, and Amnesty made some public comments about that. Do you also accept as an organisation that what's been revealed in these cables, for example, are demonstrations of clear human rights abuses or violations?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Andrew hit the nail on the head, and everyone's speaking, to be honest. For me, there's two things. I mean, firstly, from Amnesty's perspective, this is a classic case of what our whole role is in the whole international ecosystem. It's to hold truth to power under the human rights framework, and there's clear evidence that has taken place from the leaks. And if those leaks didn't take place, the public would be less informed, which is, again, the cornerstone of democracy, of a voting public. And I think that's the most important thing, is that for everybody, who has benefited from WikiLeaks and the cables they've released, it's allowed everybody to become more informed, to become more aware when they do vote and decide on the people that we put into power. And that's ultimately what it comes down to. A lot of these conversations and the sort of, zeitgeist of the moment being misinformation and people acting on not the whole truth or not the whole perspective or the whole context. And for me and Amnesty, that's it's WikiLeaks, to be honest, the thing that can cut through those sort of grey areas. Undisputed, as we saw in the documentary, it's completely undisputed, the information that's been presented. And without that, we wouldn't be aware of the human rights abuses, and people wouldn't be able to make their own judgments in the most informed ways. So it's very much in line with Amnesty, freedom of expression, speech, and information.
Thank you. Did you want to add something to that, Mary?
Just that I think we have to be very, very careful. We live in a democracy, but the way we lose rights in a democracy is incrementally. And Julian is driven by certain principles. His work has been driven by certain principles. He wanted to empower citizens, to change the power relationship between citizens and the state so that we can hold power to account. He's not ideological. It's not about, left-wing or right-wing, and he accepts that democracies and autocracies can commit human rights abuses. And I think that that's very important, that we don't allow someone who, to be prosecuted for this type of work, because if we do, it sets a terrible precedent. It will not only be used again by Western democracies, but it'll also be used by dictatorships and autocracies to say, oh, well, you do this to your journalists, why do you expect us to treat your citizens any differently? And I think that's a very dangerous precedent.
Thanks, Mary. Look, just one last question for each of the panel. Could I perhaps ask you and Greg, the US prosecutor and their campaign went out of their way over a number of years to prove that WikiLeaks had caused harm in the release of these documents. What was the final wash-up in the court case? Was there any evidence that these disclosures had caused harm versus, of course, a very clear evidence that these disclosures proved harm by US forces? Could you comment on that?
Both the US government and the Australian government have conducted inquiries into the leaks between 2009 and 2011, and neither inquiry has found any evidence of anyone being hurt or killed on account of those revelations.
Yeah, and just to add to that, the Chelsea Manning trial evidence was sought to be led by the prosecution about harm, and there was no evidence led because there was no evidence available. There's been, in the context of Australia, and this is a point that I think Malcolm Turnbull made at the time, despite Julia Gillard thinking that Assange was committing offences by putting Australian lives at risk in Afghanistan and Iraq, again, no evidence to suggest that that was the case at all, and no evidence, by the way, to suggest that in relation to any of the revelations by WikiLeaks that it has directly caused a person's life to be put at risk.
Mary, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Yes, I really regret that everyone could not have followed the hearings, because there was witness after witness testifying, and these are acclaimed investigative journalists from around the world, lawyers like Clive Stafford Smith of Reprieve, the head of an organisation called Iraq Body Count, testified as to the meticulous care that Julian took to protect the names of people, the identity rather of people named in documents, and insisted that experts meticulously redact, and slowed down the whole process of the release of the documents and the publication of stories, much to the journalists' frustration. In fact, Stefania Maurizi in Italy said the security around these documents and the care with which we were expected to treat the material exceeded by far what we were used to doing for the mafia stories. So it's most regrettable, and Stefania made this point, that this was Assange's demand was respected by every media outlet except one, whose journalists published the password to the encrypted file in a book. And this is what led to a number of websites downloading the file and decrypting it. In fact, one of the witnesses was the head of Cryptome, the first organisation to publish the decrypted file containing all that. Now that's still there. That material is still there. Cryptome hasn't been asked to take it down by the US government. They're not being prosecuted by the US government. So despite the fact that WikiLeaks were not the first to publish, they republished. The decrypted file was first published by a number of other websites. They are not being prosecuted. And he is. And I have to say, for those of us that know him, it was a relief to hear an extraordinary number of witnesses testifying to his principles and to the meticulous way that he went about his work and the care that he exercised to protect people's identities.
Thank you, Mary. Look, I'll just finish with this because I think it's important that we leave here today with some sense of what we need to do. This is inherently a political trial, as we've heard, and Julian is a political prisoner, and obviously politics is going to play a big role in what happens to him in the end. I might kind of start with you, Andrew, and the reason I'd like to ask all three of you this question in particular, and I'd have a question for you to Chamira on Amnesty's strategy from here. You've all been involved with this for some years. Do you sense things have changed at all? Scott Ludlam said publicly that one good thing about the trial was that it had kind of provided a really compact way of demolishing all the US prosecution's myths and hatchet job that they'd done on Assange over many years. But do you think there's been any progress, and how do we contact politicians to put pressure on them to actually take this issue seriously?
I think things have improved in recent times. Certainly this year the mood and the views have shifted. I think in large part because more journalists have acknowledged or are acknowledging that Julian Assange is a journalist. He got a Walkley Award, by the way, for journalism, so I reckon he's a journalist. But for a long time, a lot of journalists in Australia, probably the majority of journalists in Australia, refused to acknowledge that he was a journalist. And they didn't cover him, and when they did cover the story, it was often unhelpful or even hostile. At some point, the media world has shifted, so the narrative has shifted, and I think the Assange now has much more support than he did, and a lot of the disinformation has been hosed down. This rape allegation has complicated things from the start, even though Julian Assange is not accused of an offence that would be deemed rape in Australia. He was never charged, so he's obviously never convicted, and in fact the charges have been dropped by the authorities. And I think people are starting to learn these facts of the matter, and that the substantive matter is that a brave Australian has revealed publicly hard evidence of US war crimes.
Before I go to Greg, Barnaby Joyce, I hope I don't mind perhaps disclosing some of the things we've discussed in our parliamentary friends group, but he did say he thought bringing Assange back to Australia would be easier than bringing David Hicks back to Australia, because David Hicks was convicted as a terrorist and he was in Guantanamo Bay and caught with a gun in his hand, so to speak. Do you think writing to MPs or getting in touch with local parliamentarians, and that will make a difference if people actively campaign for the government to do something?
I mean, this is first and foremost a political issue. He's a political prisoner. The US are trying to extradite him for political reasons, and many in the UK government are happy to go along for the ride for political benefit. It is a political challenge, and the solution will probably, in my opinion, be political, not legal. I encourage all of you to lobby politicians, and don't ring me up tomorrow because I already agree with you. Meet with Erica Betts, meet with Jonathan Dummian, meet with the people you disagree with. If you can change one mind, then you've made a difference. If you spend the rest of the night in here talking among yourselves, you don't make a difference.
Greg, I don't know where you get the strength from for having hung in there all these years, by the way.
It's been a long journey. It's been a long journey, almost 10 years.
How are you feeling about this?
Look, I agree with Andrew, although I'm going to say this, Andrew. I think politically there's still a way to go. I mean, you've done a great job, and you've done an even better job, you and your team, when you get a Liberal on board. And I say that, and I think we all know that. I don't think this is no criticism at all. These guys have started with nothing. You've got to get members of the coalition. I talked to some Liberal MPs. There are some who still talk to me. Not many, but a few. I talked to Jason Folinsky, for example. He and I used to write op-eds together once upon a time. And I talked to him about it. I talked to, I know a couple of our people who do a lot of work in Canberra for us, talk regularly to Liberals. the Labor Party is a hard sell. I was talking the other day with a person who had been to see Chris Bowen, in Chris's electorate office, and Chris's view was very much that, he's committed an offence, he put lives at risk, it was reckless, he should face trial. Morrison, I think, is of that view only in a de facto sense, but I'll just say this very quickly about Hicks. I remember the Hicks campaign very well. Hicks only shifted when seats, including the then Foreign Minister Alexander Downer's seat in Mayo, started to shift on the issue. This was GetUp's first campaign, and the Howard government only moved when this became chatter in marginal seats and was being reflected in the party room. And when it got into the party room, into the joint party room and into the respective coalition parties, then they decided they had to move on it. But it was particularly because this was impacting in Mayo, which is, of course, now switched to a centre alliance. The electorate was changing and Downer was under threat in 2004, leading up to the 2007 election. And that's what it takes for governments to move on these sorts of issues. It takes marginal seats. It also takes, although for how much longer I'm not sure, but it also takes News Limited. I'll be blunt, it also takes News Limited. Now, News Limited, to be fair, on Assange, Stephen Drill did some very good stuff for us out of London early on, and I've always been a fan of feeding News Limited as much as possible on the Assange case, and writing, get your letters into News Limited papers. I don't mean the Mercury, I mean the mainland papers, because they're the ones that tend to be listened to by the Morrison government. But I also agree with Andrew, nothing substitutes, door knocking at your MP, because then they go back to Canberra and they say, I've had all these people come to see me about Assange. And then the next week, I've had all these people come to see me about Assange, just the way they said it about Hicks. So it is important.
Thanks, Greg. And just a little quick, obviously we've got News Limited, News of the World hanging in the background there, so they're not unfamiliar with all the kind of espionage stuff we're talking about tonight. Mary, ditto for you for your incredible perseverance and courage and consistency and heart on this issue. How are you feeling after many years? Do you think there's optimism?
Well, I think we have to remember that Julian has really already been in arbitrary detention for 10 years. 8 years in the embassy, and now coming up to 2. It'll be coming up to 2 years in Belmarsh, and I agree with everything that Andrew and Greg have said, and maybe we should be holding these forums in marginal seats. I think that would be a very good move, but I think. What we do need to apply pressure to the Prime Minister. And I take your point, Greg, that there are no Liberal Party members in Andrew's group, but they're not going to do what their boss doesn't want them to do. So it's the boss that we need to apply pressure to. We can't let him off the hook. Saying he's got to go and face the music is just not good enough. If he doesn't think that Dan Oakes needs to face the music in an Australian court where he's not going to end up in a steel shoebox for the rest of his life, then we can't let him get. So the Prime Minister and the media, I would bring up, these, what we call in the media, transmission reports in television, all the telephone calls get logged, letters to, or ring up, major newspapers and say, why aren't you doing a story on this? And how can you write a story on press freedom and not mention Assange? We, the public, need to make a bigger noise about Julian so that they get it, that the voters are not happy.
Chamira, what's just interested in what's Amnesty's strategy from here? And, you know, would you guys, for example, be prepared to get you've got a lot of members and supporters.
Yeah.
Would you be prepared to get them to, you know, send emails to their local reps as well at some stage, or is that something you might consider?
Yeah, absolutely. I just wanted to firstly echo the point of optimism, because I think regardless of what's taken place, the only way forward, it has to be grounded in optimism. And there's been massive gains in the last year when you know, projected from a year ago and saw perhaps the public narrative, and sentiment shift in a fairly short period of time. I know there was a lot of years of work that sort of tried to build that momentum. I think we're there, and we got to carry that forward, and everyone has a part to play, there's no doubt. And along those lines, from Amnesty's perspective, generally our prongs of attack, I suppose, when we're trying to achieve public sentiment change and government policy change and action, is really three things. Firstly, it's research, or relying on very good research, then leveraging our movement through, like, as you mentioned, phone calls, signing petitions. So that petition was 400K. Australia, the Australian office was responsible for global amnesty in this instance, because we've been driving it more than anyone else, to be honest. And whilst there's a lot of agreements across many of the other offices, it's certainly at its heart an Australian issue, and he is an Aussie as well. And so we've been seeing a massive uptick in people. We've been getting phone calls every day saying, you need to do more, you need to do more. And they haven't fallen on deaf ears. So the final thing I wanted to mention was obviously advocacy and lobbying government. So Amnesty generally tends to do a number of things quite publicly and loudly, and also do things quietly in the background as not to jeopardize too much. And a lot of that is related to the politicians. So our next plan of attack, which I'm trying to organize now, is an address to, or a briefing to, the crossbench, with a broad range of speakers from various industries, and trying to get the right people in the room, I suppose, to really speak to the crossbench, get as many people attending, and then putting pressure on the government as well. I echo the sentiments about targeting marginal seats. I think that's a very good strategic and tactical move, no doubt. And speaking to Bob Carr recently, and he said he did a talk in his local electorate, and he said the turnout was amazing. You know, couldn't believe how many people rocked up, and they were quite favourable, and they were quite accepting of what was being said. There wasn't much challenging like there was before. Bob, can you do more? And this, again, hasn't just happened overnight. It's a lot of people cumulatively adding up, snowballing, and I see that every day with the work Amnesty does, because that's usually how things go. It's these campaigns that snowball. Madison Nauru, recently we did a robo-calling, targeted local MP calling party, let's say, for a couple of hours, which was extremely effective. And that's something that we may look to do as well. And as I said, the address, and keeping up the public pressure and statements, and leveraging all our contacts and kind of influence in those areas. So we won't be dropping the ball, and I'll certainly be making sure it doesn't happen either.
Thanks a lot, Chamira. Look, I just also want to give a quick shout out to Free Assange Hobart. You may see some flyers outside. That group's been very active now for a number of years. I'm not sure if Tristan, are you here? Yep, put your hand up at the back there. Go, if you haven't had a chat to him, please go and introduce yourself. They're doing great work, and they've got a Facebook page with a lot of information. But if you want to sign up and get on their list, we all need to get a lot more active. As everyone's pointed out tonight from this fantastic panel, it's down to us. We simply can't let this stand. We can't let this stand. And I feel like we're just starting to crack the nut now. And look, please get involved if you're not already. We are having another one of these tomorrow night, and I'm not sure if we've locked you in yet, Greg, but Greg and Mary are phoning in tomorrow night in Launceston, so that is a marginal seat, Mary. And we have Dean Yates tomorrow night, who was the Reuters head of Baghdad, who lost his two friends in collateral murder. And he has been through murder himself in the last 10 years of his life since that's happened. And he'll be speaking in Launceston tomorrow night as well about his experience with the US military, and he's actually also given evidence in Julian's court case too. So we're going to continue these and hopefully roll them out around the country. Go back to COVID willing, go back to some cross-party lines. These are not political events. We want as many politicians to be involved, but we also want campaigners to organise these and get people in, get your friends in. Let's get talking and let's continue to do something about it. So thanks for coming tonight, and we'll all look forward to keeping in touch with you. And thanks, a special thanks to the panel, please, for giving up their time.
Good gig. Good gig.
Thanks, Peter. Really good, mate.
And sorry, lastly, also a very special thanks to all those who organised tonight, those who got here early and set up the chairs, and there's been a whole bunch of volunteers, as well as, of course, Liz in my office has done a fantastic job. So thank you. We'll look forward to the next one.